Good morning and welcome to this week's Jump recruitment discussion. This webinar was actually planned 2 weeks ago, but due to circumstances beyond our control, we had to rearrange it, for which we apologise. But the topic we were going to discuss was this: recruitment leaders. It's easy when the market's good, but are you good enough to lead a recovery? And I've phased some of the questions, Dave and Paul, just so you're aware, because I know some of you probably haven't read the questions. But I've phased some of the questions.
Outrageous.
Outrageous. That was outrageous. I'll go through my text this morning. Can you send me the questions? Can you send me the questions? Can you send me the link? But so I phased some of the questions, so it sort of brings some of our personal experience on the topic. And so we've all been through many downturns, and as I mentioned, we survived them all. We've always come out stronger from the other side. So I thought it'd be good to give some of our personal experiences from this. Okay. So the first question then is, when revenue dries up and pressure builds, how do you stop short-term panic from derailing your long-term strategy?
You want to go first, Dave? You look like you're in a prison cell, by the way, today.
I feel, it does look, the background's not great, is it? It's better than the one you could have had.
Well, okay, I'll kick this off then. So, I mean, for me, it's a couple of things here, Howard. I think number one, you need to be very aware of your own strategies for the business. You know, I think if you've ever worked in organizations who hop from foot to foot because something changes, it becomes pretty demoralizing. You know, right, we're going to run this way, and then something happens. No, stop what you're doing. We're going to do it this way. No, stop what you're doing. We're going to do it this way. It's just impossible to work for that type of leadership. You just have no level of certainty. Actually, it sounds a little bit like current American administration, but I shouldn't really say that in public, should I? Okay, I just did, I think. So, I mean, I think that it becomes demoralizing. You never really know where you're going and what's going to happen. What you do is you stick true to your strategy, but what you also need is to be aware of what else is going on out there. So as a leader, it's not just about being focused internally on what's happening within your business and dealing with those issues, but it's perhaps having a much better understanding of the overall market. And that, I think, comes down to the intelligence you're gathering from clients, the intelligence you're gathering from the sectors you're involved in, and so forth. And that should help you to start to consider any changes that you need to make, but in advance of any situations that occur. So I think that it's very important to make sure, as all the big management books discuss, that most of your time is spent looking outside of the business and not focused on the minutiae in the business. And I know it's terribly difficult. Easier to say than actually perform, but the reality is there. If you consistently knee-jerk every time something happens in your business, then it's, as I said, demoralizing for your people. It leads to people leaving, and your business just jolts from one position to another. It never really progresses. So having that external view on the market is super important to help you to make those medium to long-term wise decisions.
Yeah, and added to that, I think that the first thing is tell yourself if you're feeling panicky because of the circumstances, the market, the performance, the cash, whatever it is, recognize that, okay, it's okay to panic. It's what you do with it, because you're the leader. So you need to deal with that first and try not to execute on anything while you're in panic mode. Everybody has that sense of doom and gloom and panic and what am I going to do and where do I go? And that's okay to have that feeling. It's what you do with that feeling. And you need to take a bit of time, either space out of the office, talk to some trusted mates, talk to some people in the business, in the recruitment sector that you know, and not necessarily your team, and just get yourself back into a shape where that you know you can face your people with confidence, because they're looking to you for leadership and direction. And if you're kind of all over the place, you need to get yourself right first. So I'd start with yourself, get yourself in that space of, okay, I'm now not going to panic. But don't beat yourself up by panicking, because every single one of us has been at that stage and has been there, and that's the feeling that you get. And I know we're all in recruitment and we're supposed to say nobody panics. You know what? They absolutely do, because we're all humans. So recognize that first, get yourself right, and then go and face the truth.
I think echoing what both of you said there about you need to have a strategy and you need to focus on what's working and what's not working. But you've also got to understand is what's happened and what's got you to the point. And I think that's what a lot of people do. They realized that either they've been too reliant on a certain number of clients or they haven't done enough business development, and they're suddenly putting different processes in place, and that doesn't create that instant nirvana. It doesn't create that instant, success. And so you need to start prioritizing certain things, and you need to look at what you've stopped doing, what you should be doing, and prioritize those things. And then that goes back to your strategy. What's your strategy doing, and how are you sticking to that strategy? And I think that needs to be purely about your business development. Your priority, you need to stop working poor quality roles, because what happens when we get desperate is we start to work roles that we're never going to fill. And it becomes a huge problem that your time that you allocate to those roles that you never fill, if you'd allocated them to business development, and I put business development into those three products of buying clients, lapsed clients, and new clients, if you stop doing that because you're desperate to fill a role that you've probably got a 10% chance of filling, you'd have had a better chance of speaking to your clients or your lapsed clients or new clients and build new roles. But to Paul's comment, if you haven't got a strategy, you've got a big problem coming up ahead. So you need to have a proper strategy to drive yourself through that. So let's change that then. In a tough market, we all see this constantly motivation dips. So how do you balance the emotional grit of a leadership while reigniting the belief and drive within your team? And that could be either as a solo business or as a larger business, because we know when morale hits the floor, it's a problem. So how do we balance that emotional grit that the leader needs while reigniting the belief and drive within your team?
Oh, I think Dave said something, well, not for the first time. Let's just give him a little bit of credit here.
Howard, what's coming?
Yeah, well, he said something fairly wise, I think, and that
I've got my pen out, Dave, just in case.
I just didn't make a note. Dave said something wise, and that is, I think you've got to look after your own emotional positioning. As you said correctly, Dave, even if you're the most experienced leader, you're human, and emotion can take its grip. And I think if you rely on emotion to govern decisions, that sort of middle part of your brain instead of the front part of your brain, which is all about the rational thinking, then you're in trouble. It's all. I mean, you could say it's all well and good if you're on your own, although it isn't, to be driven by emotion. But it's absolutely an imperative that you're not driven by emotion when you're managing people. So I think keeping that balance is not an easy thing, and we've all been there. We've all had businesses to run and large businesses to run. Somehow, as a leader, you have to be seen as calm and calculated and upbeat, motivational, inspirational, all those lovely words. When inside, you're all over the place, and it's terribly difficult. It's sometimes an act to be truthful. Putting on that brave face, smiling in the face of adversity, and it's sometimes extremely difficult. You're supposed to know the answers. You're supposed to know which way the wind's going to blow, and the truth is, in many instances, you don't. But exercising panic or emotion and talking in that way is guaranteed to cause a self-fulfilling prophecy. So language is really important here. What you say and how you say it, verbally and in writing, has a massive implication. You have to be extremely careful about what you say. I mean, anyone that watches politics knows that things get spun. So be careful. Make sure that what you talk about is very positive. I said earlier, make certain that you're aware of your market, your sectors, your clients' sentiments, what's going on, because good news is often buried amongst all of the bad news. Very easy just to concentrate on everything that's dreadful. If you turn on TV, listen to the radio, everything's awful. I mean, it is really depressing presently listening to the news, but there is good news in amongst what goes on out there, and you have to dig for it. But good news doesn't sell newspapers, as they used to say. And I think if you're running a business, it's your job to look for the good news. And that also means looking internally at the statistics, at the data. What's going well for the business? Who's doing well? Why is it going well? Celebrate the good stuff. Even if the good stuff, fairly small triumphs, make sure you shout and scream about those things. Every time something half decent occurs, be the first person to scream and shout and give praise to the people that have done those things. Don't focus on the bad stuff, because that's a guarantee to put your business and yourself in a worse position. And the other thing I think briefly is, and you said it again, Dave, is lean out to people that you can trust. Make sure that you've got someone, at least one person, who's a confidant. because you need somebody you can truly express your feelings to, and it's not the people around you. So make sure that you can vent in a direction where it's safe, and that's also super important.
I think from a motivation point of view as well, look for the little wins. If you've got a strategy, which you said you should have, when things are tough and you've got a tough week ahead or a tough 4 weeks ahead or whatever, and you've got the bank on your back and your people on your back, from a motivation point of view, look for things that cheer you on to the next step. So you've got to implement your strategy. Of course, you know that, but that's far away. What can you do today that you can celebrate today, that you can motivate others today? Is it getting some extra candidates on board? Is it getting some feedback put on the website? Is it cheering on, as you said, Paul, cheering on individual consultants? Look for the little wins that bring that little bit of extra motivation. A number of those together begin to generate that feeling. And then as a leader, you're motivated because you see some of the others being successful. And where you can with your teams, buddy them up as well. So it's not you, if you're running a team of four, say, it's you and two lots of two, rather than you and four lots of one. Buddy people up to encourage one another, to keep their spirit high. I mean, it's like a sports team. If you're fighting a relegation battle, you need everybody on your side. So you celebrate the corner as well as the goal. You celebrate the cross as well as the goal. So you've got to look for that in your business. What can I celebrate that can directly affect the business today, and then the next few days, and then the next week? And those little bits, those little chunks will help the strategy take care of itself.
I love going last on these type of questions because obviously what's left. Paul, a long soliloquy from Paul then of what was actually going on. But I think one of the questions that I always think about when it's a tough market is I stop reading the press, because what you said there, Paul, is absolutely right. Good news doesn't sell, bad news does. And you hear about what's going on at the moment, how many recruit aces are going under, how the market's that, etc. Hang on a minute, but the IMF have just said the UK market's going to grow bigger than it thought it was going to grow and things like that.
Yeah.
And I always think that even in the hardest market, there are clients that are buying. And so it's about you finding those clients and creating the capability of opening those clients and developing those clients. And your comment there, Dave, about celebrating the little wins is absolutely important. Everyone needs to be in there. So I think you need to stop blaming the people and start correcting your processes that then start to create those wins. Because sometimes what we do is we blame the people rather than actually look at the processes and look at our strategy and we look at that. So we need to change that. And I think when we start this change, if you keep that process to yourself and you keep driving what you want to deliver, etc., but you never involve your people in the changes or helping them develop a strategy, etc., then they're never really engaged with that strategy. So I think it's getting them involved in the change, getting involved in building the strategy, getting involved in all the little things. And that starts to remove the negative elements because they're part of that strategy. They can start to bring those things out and you can start to eradicate the negative elements because it's their strategy now. They own it. It's not just yours. It's theirs. It's all of our strategy. And therefore, we've all got the opportunity to deliver that strategy. And therefore, it becomes a little bit more motivational, a little bit more personal to each other rather than just a strategy that you're trying to drive that people maybe not liking or liking, etc. So here's the first question then about our personal side then. What's the biggest execution gap you faced in your career during a downturn, and what specific actions specific actions helped close it?
18 months or so ago, working with one of the companies that I'm involved with, they had a significant number of their contract base on site at a client that got taken over by a large MSP, and they essentially lost the income, the annuity income of more than 100 contractors over a period of 12 months. And there was no way back. And it's a really relatively common story if you're a smallish supplier against one of the big boys. And that absolutely induced a set of panic, because part of the strategy of working with that client and others like them was to build up an annuity contractors, to invest in newer sections so that we didn't have to rely on MSP type work. So suddenly it was a case of addressing where we were, looking at the contractors we had and literally putting a plan in place to place as many of those at a 9-10% margin somewhere else. And we worked out that if we could place 22 of them at 13% somewhere else, that was going to give us the same annuity of income at about 75 of them as to where they were. So it was looking at those sort of numbers. So it's working with the finance team, looking at the numbers, working at the market team, looking at marketing team, looking at where we could place them, making sure that everybody on the floor had the visibility of the names of those contractors. And of course, contractors can choose. They can stay and they have the option to stay, or they can go. So it was understanding their motivation, make sure we were doing right by them, but also reminding ourselves to execute on the strategy of we don't want a percentage of our income to be behind MSPs because this is the sort of thing that can happen. And part of that strategy was, can we build an MSP project for smaller SME clients, which is exactly what we've done. And now we have 2 of our own MSPs for mid-sized clients, not big clients. And we are also, I would say this, treating the agencies better than we ourselves were treated by the company that took over this big engineering firm.
I mean, I think that if you talk about downturns, and it doesn't immediately spring to mind, but I suppose the one that I would imagine most people will associate with was COVID. Watching Boris on the TV saying, "Don't leave your home," and then sitting down after that thinking, "Okay, what does this mean?" And then I think the following morning, calling all of my clients who, like me, were completely traumatized by what was occurring. It felt like we were going to war. I suppose, in a sense, we were. What did it mean for their business, for my business? What was going to happen next? And nobody had any answers. This was, as everyone recall, before bounce back loans and other announcements were made to assist business. But at that moment, people I was speaking to thought, at best, I've got 3 months before I go bust. You know, I've got 3 months money in the bank, 4 months money in the bank. After that, I'm done. And I had call after call after call like that, as I'm sure you guys did with clients at the time. And I had no answers whatsoever. Why would I have answers? Nobody gave me any clues. And I think that what got us past that point, frankly, was pulling together, trying to. And I remember it was like gallows humor. It sounds an odd thing to say, but we were laughing a lot at the time. You know, you felt that was the right reaction, to try to find some amusement in all of it. And at the same time, think clinically about what we could do. And to your point, Dave, it was about looking at the finances. How do we look at our cost base? Where is it possible still to make some money, if at all? How are we going to maneuver through this position? And I think a large part of that was communication. I was consistently talking to clients, literally countless times during the week, trying to keep them very tight, very close, trying to keep morale up, trying to keep my own morale up, because it did occur to me that I also was in a position when I couldn't make any income, and try and work through it. But at the same time, was reaching out to people that I hoped would be in the know, would have more knowledge about what was going on than I had at that point. So really trying very hard to link in with people that had greater market intelligence than mine, and then leaning on that information and passing that around. And also being practical. Howard and I were really talking to people like the REC at the time, putting together webinars and putting information together to give people whatever we could find to help them and so forth. So if I think of a crisis moment and getting morale up and keeping things moving, I can't think of anything more traumatic than that early week or so after the discussion around stay at home, it's COVID, and save your lives. And I know it's one of those surreal moments we'll look back on and think, did that actually happen? But it really did at the time. And of course, things did improve and we got ourselves out of it, and we ended up, and here's a lesson, we ended up in a post-COVID boom, as everyone in recruitment remembers. So an absolute critical issue that demonstrated what goes down does come up, and I think something to lean on during these tougher times. We have been through worse, and there was no hope, it felt, that in those early days, whereas now as you've just said, there's always good news if you look for it, and there's every reason to think that things will improve.
I think when I looked at my biggest execution gap when I wrote this question, I went back to my first non-billing manager's role, where I inherited an office that was at war with each other. Everyone hated each other, etc. No strategy, no plan of what they were doing. It was all, dog eat dog type scenario. And recruitment in a lot of places was like that. And I related that back to some of my clients during that COVID period who were having the same issues. And what I found was that there was two people who dominated the office. One was a very negative person, one was a very, very positive person. And it was about separating those people out and driving the strategy and say, right, this is the strategy. And it's been holding people accountable to that strategy. And it was really obvious after 3 or 4 months that one of them was absolutely on board with the strategy, and everybody that was on board with that person was starting to really perform, but the other person was really struggling with that strategy. And we ended up removing the person that was struggling with the strategy. And that person happened to be one of the biggest billers in the business, happened to be one of the biggest billers in the actual company. Competing for people at that time was a huge operation. But it was having the bravery of taking the plan, making the plan work, getting everybody on board with that plan. And those people that weren't on board, that was creating a negative atmosphere and were producing, and they were creating the execution gap because they were removing people from the business. People were leaving because of that. Those people removing them from the operation. And once we did that, the business started to boom, and we were right in the middle of the downturn after year 2000 from an IT perspective, because we had the Y2K boom, and then it all went downhill for about 18 months, where everything sort of quieted off. All of a sudden driving that through. And it was having the guts to actually go away and do that and put that strategy in place and sticking to the strategy. And those people that didn't want to stick with that strategy, then they weren't right for the business. And I think that's the bit that I learned, is that if you have a strategy, you've got to stick to that strategy and drive that strategy. Parts of people helped me build the strategy, helped me execute the strategy, but we kept each other accountable. And I think that's the bit, it's keeping each other accountable for your part of the downturn, so we can turn it into an upturn rather than just letting people run willy-nilly and have their own strategies that just never work and never collide. So the other one, this is the thing that when I wrote this question, it was, again, something that I thought was, we could come out with answers that would really help people at this moment in time. Leaders often fall into the trap of, I hope it gets better. So can you share a time when you had to ditch hope and create a clear, actionable strategy, and what were the outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I remember being recruited to a business after Office Angels that was I wasn't aware of the fact until I got there that it was in dire straits, and I had to try and rescue the business. It owed a small fortune. I'd been lied to during the interviews, and we were weeks away from going out of business. So once I'd got all the information and facts together, it was then a question of trying to figure out how we could maneuver our way into a better place. And a lot of that came down, I think, to collecting my management team, making sure they were very aware of what we needed to do. So I had very clear strategies in place. How were we going to work our way through it? I needed to buy myself time to work alongside our accountant and indeed a forensic accountant we got in to help us, because we were going to need to raise £3 million. And I worked tirelessly for weeks and weeks and weeks in trying to save the business, which we actually did eventually. And during that period of time, the thing that I learned, and it's never left me, was how important it is. And go back to the earlier question about keeping morale up. There were people very close to me that were aware of how dire the situation was, but none of them left. And it was a question of trying to make sure that everybody in the business, although they're not as well informed about the dire situation we were in as the senior staff, but those guys had a pretty strong understanding that we were in trouble. But keeping morale up, because had any of them left us, it would have only made our position even worse. And yet I wasn't aware of the fact that I wasn't even certain that we could pay people at the end of the month. Our cash flow was in such a bad place. So again, it's back to trying to get rid of the emotion, which was extremely difficult, I can tell you. But trying to think rationally, leaning on people around me and asking them to do things that maybe in some instances were way beyond what might have appeared in their job description, but then feeling delighted that they were keen to do whatever it would take to keep the business moving and to support me, and just making sure that our communication was super tight. We would have meetings 4 or 5 times a day, constantly talking, setting short-term goals, what we're going to achieve in the next hour, the next 2 hours, the next 3 hours, everybody taking a piece of those actions and working furiously to get them achieved. So when we reconvened into our scrums, we'd achieve certain things, and then off we went again for the next 2 to 3 hours. And it was keeping that momentum going. And to this day, I think, although I've had some great moments in recruitment, I've always feel that my proudest moment was during that period, eventually saving the business, but not losing a single person during that crisis. And it really was a crisis. So I think this comes down to thinking rationally, but making sure you get your team around you. Who's going to jump over the top of the trench when you blow your whistle? And you certainly find that out pretty quickly during a crisis.
So I'm going to slightly disagree with the question, because I know somebody often says hope is not a strategy. I think hope is a strategy. And I'm going to give a shout out to a good buddy of mine who's the Bishop of Leeds, a guy called Nick Baines. And Nick wrote a brilliant book called Hungry for Hope. And the whole premise of that is actually what we need is hope. Because hope put in the right place brings confidence, it brings strength, and it brings motivation. And so hope for me is a really, really positive word. And in a world in which we're living in right now, hope is a framework for building things. So I would say to you that if you are in that situation where you're just hoping things will get better, turn that around and say, well, what does hope really mean? And hope is about getting the motivation right, bringing strength to an order, and also it's about confidence. And that, for me, hope is one of the most positive words, that you should have that in your strategy. Hope without any strategy, of course, is more difficult. But hope is a really positive thing. And I can think of lots of little examples in my recruitment career where we've said things like, oh, I hope this happens, and I hope that happens. And then you just turn that around to say, well, what does hope look like in that situation? And then when you pull it apart, actually, it is hope, but it's also order. There's also a list of things that you've got to do, or some meetings you've got to have, or some feedback you've got to give. And then it feels less of a negative word, hope, much more of a positive word. And for me, hope's like a trampoline. Yeah, if you're standing off a trampoline and you think, I hope I can get in the air, well, you've got to get on the trampoline and start bouncing. So if you're in that situation where you need a bit of hope, see that as a positive thing. And what are you going to do about it to bring order, to bring motivation, to bring confidence?
And buy a trampoline.
And buy a trampoline, yeah.
And one of those net that goes round it.
Yeah.
Yeah, health and safety. You've got to think about
that. Of course. So I think I took this when I had a call from a client, a business who's now a client. And they had a fair number of people in the business, were looking after a reasonably large client, and most of their business, 90% of their business came from that client. And they, the comment of the owner was they were hoping that client would carry on forever. And that client stopped.
Right.
And they had no contingency, nothing else to do from there. And so when I entered the building and started to talk to them, we started to pull a strategy together. And we had a strategy that was long-term, medium-term, and short-term. And the short-term was about what can we do now? What can we do with the clients that we are working with and the client that's stopped? What can we do with the residual candidates that can help short-term revenue streams? But then what we could do for the future, and we could look at long-term and what we were doing. And they were in an engineering market. The market was pretty tight, pretty dire. It was not a great market for them. And we started to pivot into the green market. And if you look at their business now, they're in a whole different situation. So we used that short-term strategy of, right, we know that big client's gone, right, let's stop crying about it. Let's start looking at what we can do. We looked at all the candidates that had come out of that client and where they'd gone, and we started to pick up work from those in the short term. We then looked at what long-term strategy we wanted to be and where we wanted to be, and we started to drive to do that. So we had the two strategies running side by side. But what we tried to do is remove two words. I removed the word hope. We hope this gets better. It's going to get better. And I removed the word try. I'm going to try and do that. Because in my world, in my own head, as soon as someone says to me, I'm going to try and do something, they've already lined the excuse of why it hadn't worked.
Yeah.
So I am going to do this. Okay. So we started to change the terminology. You talked about that a little bit early on about Paul, about the terminology, making the terminology really positive. And so we started to use words that were positive reinforcement all the way through. When we wrote the strategy, it was positive work reinforcement all the way through. So all the way through the strategy, when people had them, I gave everyone a copy of the strategy. And every time we had a meeting, we went back and we delivered that strategy and we highlighted the words that we thought that were working. And we would start to remove words and change words in that strategy. So that strategy became a really powerful document of where we're moving forward. And as we started to tick the things off that were working and started to readdress the things that weren't working, then that hope, which they were looking for, of we can now see the light at the end of the tunnel, became something that you talked about there, Dave, that they could then cling on to and then drive. But at the beginning, when it was all dark, it wasn't about hope. It was about, you've got to get down in the trenches and dig your way out of here. There's no hope. Let's start to work on the things that we know that we can do and the things that we know that we can affect and drive that forward. So I think there's a lot of things in there that from all three of us that people can look at. This is one that I've had this question a lot over the recent times from people I've been working with and people who are, come to talk to me about how we can work together and things like that. Every business leader and consultant goes through hard times. And sometimes it's not the market that's the problem. And I always class that sometimes it's the mirror. So what's the brutal truth about your own career? Did you have to confront in a downturn, and how did you face them and change them? So what was the brutal truth where you had to change something, you had to do something? It wasn't the market. It was just a massive problem.
I had one. I was running a business that I've inherited a trading situation that was far from great, and spent quite a lot of time on cash calls with the bank and all of that good stuff. And I thought, without sounding arrogant, I was doing a reasonable job of trying to turn it around. When two of the recruitment leaders in the business said to me, the problem with you, Dave, is you don't spend that much time with the customers. And it was a real look in the mirror situation, thinking, oh, there's me thinking I'm doing an okay job and trading's becoming a little bit better and we're generating cash. But the floor, because these two were representatives of the floor, thought I was probably in the office too much. I was on calls with banks and I had shareholder meetings and things like that. And it was a real wake-up call. Because when I looked at it, I looked at my diary and thought, I haven't really been on site with this customer, that customer. So I changed it. And they were absolutely right to say what they said. They were absolutely right in the delivery of it. And if I reflected upon myself, look in the mirror, have I? I mean, I haven't spent as much time. And actually, I always preach about make sure you know what your customer's doing, make sure you know what the market's doing. You only find that out with your customers. So the next 3 months, I made sure that I was spending a lot more time out with the customers. I already knew that. I just wasn't doing it. So it was a real reflection that I needed to take hold of and change.
And I think for me, I grew up, and I think you two did as well, in a fairly sort of brutal environment in recruitment. Any sign of vulnerability would be leapt on by other people. And so you reached a point where you were nervous. I was certainly nervous to ask for help when I needed it. I knew that people around me would seize on that. It's a weakness. He doesn't know what he's doing. It was a real dog-eat-dog environment. I mean, it made you tougher and stronger, but in me, it also did something else. It made me nervous to ask for help. I felt that asking for help would be seen as a weakness, that people would seize on that. Now, I reached a point of seniority, particularly when I took over running as the MD of Office Angels, and I had 600 odd people in that business. I reached a point where I was having to deal with things that I really had no experience of. Yeah, I really didn't know what I was doing. I hadn't had a job like that before. And for the most part, in all those years that it taken me to get to that position, I'd kind of figured out things. I'd learned from other people by watching and listening and doing stuff myself, and to a large extent followed my own intuition and my own talent, if you like. But I'd now reached a point where certain things which were really critical for the business were coming across my desk, and I really didn't know how to handle them. For me, the big sort of wake up was actually leaning into people around me that I knew had more knowledge of certain things that I had, and asking them to help me, which I found very hard to do. I think pride was a big factor with me. But then I thought I had no choice. I had to make the right decisions for the business, and I genuinely recognized, to use your phrase, Howard, that I was looking in the mirror, that I wasn't equipped to answer the questions that were being posed of me. So I asked people for help, and to my utter amazement and delight, I discovered that they were thrilled to help me. They didn't see me as being weak because I'd asked for assistance. I think they felt flattered that I'd asked them, and I got fantastic support and direction from those people around me. It helped to forge a brilliant leadership team. And it was just a big lesson for me. Ask for help when you don't know what you're doing, when you're not sure what's going on, when you don't really understand what to do next. Talk to people that you believe have better experience, better knowledge, better understanding of the situation. And don't be frightened to open up to people that you trust. And I think for me, it was a massive lesson in learning how to manage a great business and making a great business a brilliant business. It's something I've never forgotten. I remember being very panicked at the time, but I didn't regret it, that I asked people around me for assistance and support. I was never seen as a weak leader because of it. I think it placed me in a completely stronger position as a result. So there you go, an admission.
I think I've had a similar experience, Paul, when I inherited an office up in Scotland, and I remember having the first conversation with the office manager on the Monday and invited them to the team meeting on the Friday with all the managers in my team and in my group of businesses. And on the Monday, he was waxing lyrical about having 435 contractors out. Friday didn't turn up to the meeting. So on Monday, I called him. I thought, could be, yeah, he's new. He just didn't realise he had to turn up. So rang on Monday. He said, I daren't turn up, Howard. I said, why is not? I said, we've now got 35. I said, why? What's happened? He said, our biggest client has pulled every single contractor. So middle of 2008, big banking client up in Scotland, they pulled every single contractor. And I'd never run a key account business. I was always loved spot business, never run a key account business. I did exactly what you did to Paul. I reached out to other people and said, right, what's the story? What's the plan? How are we going to deal with this? What we're going to do? And we pulled a strategy together, and we started to stick to that strategy, and we started to pivot into sort of slightly different areas of what we could do. And at that time, it was not about reinventing the wheel. It was about going back to core basics and what we did. So we went back into a contingency, permanent contingency temp type operation rather than a big service operation. And we started to find all the small clients that would use similar type of candidates. And it took us a while, that we started to grow and started to develop again. And it was that look in the mirror and going, I haven't got a clue what I'm doing with these type of people. So it was about getting hold of the training board. You need to be here every week. It was about me getting involved, sitting there, going out with all the clients, going out to see clients, as you said, David, what have you. But it was about making it a group experience and changing that. And yes, we lost a few people along the way that didn't want to be involved in a sales operation. They would want to be a key accounts operation. But in 2008, that wasn't capable. It wasn't there because those big operations all stopped, especially in the banking market. And it was that I remember having that conversation on the Monday and putting the phone down and thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do? And you've got to look in the mirror and say, right, we need to do something. And so it's the same as you, Paul. Reaching out to other people is really important, and having the guts to reach out and admit that you are drowning, you don't know what's going on. And it's a real big one. So here's a different type of question then. During hard times, leaders often talk about staying visible. Practically speaking, what did you do to stay close to your people and your clients when it really mattered?
I think, Dave said this earlier. Sitting in your office, even though I know, you're working hard, you're doing everything you can, is not the answer. You have to be visible. That means, as Dave mentioned, being out in front of clients, talking to as many as you can. It means spending a huge amount of time with your people. And I certainly did that too, in moments of crisis. In fact, it wasn't just crisis. I think the thing that you learn from um, heightened communication is that it works. And so why would you only communicate consistently and effectively when things are tough? You don't. You do it all the time. And in fact, you do it when things are going great. You make sure as a leader, you remain visible in every sense with clients, with your own people. I spent huge amounts of time on the road, running around 100 odd offices around the country, meeting people and my people, making sure that I spent time with them and that I was hopefully inspirational when I met them, even if I wasn't feeling well or I wasn't feeling great that day. My job was to turn up and make certain that by the time I left their office, they were pumped and up for it. That was my job. I was Mr. Mr. Motivator, even when I didn't feel like that myself. That's part of being a leader. You have to be up for it constantly, and sometimes it's easy. You have high energy, you feel great, things are going well, and sometimes, frankly, you have to fake it. But that's your job. You have to be the ultimate professional. And I think that being visible is super important. I was watching a documentary on Bank Holiday about the Blitz in London. It's really excellent, by the way. If you get a chance to see it, it's on Sky. And it was the Blitz in colour, and it was they were talking, must have been filmed a few years ago, to survivors of the Blitz and what happened in London during the early weeks, and then ultimately the Blitz. And the thing that you become aware of as you watch it is not just the bravery of people and how they got on with things, but the camaraderie that it developed amongst the Londoners, the people that were being bombed on. I mean, the most appalling things happened, and I was reminded of those when I watched it. But they had a leader at the time, whether you thought politically of him well or not, Churchill, who was very visible constantly, and we still quote from his speeches to this day. He was a brilliant communicator. He was voted out directly after the war, we know that. But during the war, huge communicator, talking very loudly and very positively during very bleak times. And I know that's an extreme example, but it is something to think about when things are tough, that you have to be visible and you have to choose your words carefully. I said it very, very early on. Language matters. What you say and how you say it matters. So you need to think about that and the impact you have on people. And it's your job to keep everyone around you motivated. If you're a solopreneur, we often refer to single business people that way, then you also need to make sure that you're talking to yourself in a positive way. And it sounds an odd thing to say, but we also said, go and talk to people you trust, people like us or people that you're close to. Make sure that you can remain positive. Go home every evening feeling that you've made a difference every day.
I think also to add to that, Paul, leadership is like osmosis. You have to share your leadership style and the messages you want to communicate with other people. Obviously, if you're a solo entrepreneur, that doesn't work. But if you're running a team of people, don't carry everything yourself. So visibility isn't just physical visibility. The strategy, the words, the direction of the business, make sure that your people know about that. And if you've got two or three deputies in other roles or office managers, whatever it is, make sure they are communicating to their people in the style and the passion that you would. So you're passing on the way that you communicate things. Now they will use their own way of communicating it, but just make sure that as much of what you're trying to do with your company and for your people is shared across the whole piece. And this is really true as we work now with so many of our people from home, because visibly they don't see you as much as they'd like to do. So that may be more on Zoom, that may be some fun things that you do, that may be communicating in a different way, making up an animation, doing a different podcast. Communicate as widely as you can with as many different ways as you can. Just conscious of time, mate. So it's
Yeah. So I looked at this in a very simple way. I thought, and I went back to my Scottish issue. And I remember sort of about week 3 or week 4 after the announcement. I remember sat there one night because I go to Scotland twice a month, stay 2 days, stay overnight, and I sat in the office, and one of the guys is sat there working a job still, and I said, "Give us a job. Let's start resourcing the job. Let's get it finished. Let's get it done." And it was really interesting. The next time I went up, he took me to one side, said, "You won't believe what happened. The following night, 2 people stayed. The following night after that, 3 people stayed because you'd stayed and you'd helped me find more people for the job." And so it's about getting involved with your people, I think, and it's doing what they're doing. It's about sat at the coalface and showing that you're sat there prepared to do the hard yards with them, not just being the man at the top or the person at the top. And I think your comment there about solo businesses not being able to talk positive to yourselves, I think solo businesses are the ones that probably speak more positive about themselves because they're the ones who've got to do that. Otherwise, you've got a problem. So I think it's about celebrating success, but I think it's also about being human enough to sit at the coalface with your team and do the things that they're doing at the time that it needs to be done, rather than sat there being, well, I'm the boss, I can go home now at 5 o'clock, you get on with it. I think it's sat there being present at the time from there. So I have one last question. It's whether you want to sit and listen to the last question or not. I know we're sort of pushing on time, but the last question is this: how do you differentiate people who lack skills versus those who lack the will to succeed, especially in a tough marketplace?
Well, I think this comes back to the old corny cliche about when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And when it is tough, you certainly very quickly figure out who's up for it and who isn't. And that's got almost nothing to do with talent, to be perfectly honest. It's got to do with their makeup as a human being. I was always amazed and remain amazed that during difficult, challenging moments, when you ask for people to assist, sometimes the hands that go in the air are not the ones you necessarily expected to see. And sometimes people who were fairly anonymous in your business suddenly become absolutely present, are there, they want to help, they want to do stuff. And the people that you genuinely thought would be up for it, would be there to support you, sometimes really let you down. So I think it comes down to something that we ought to interview for as best we can when we bring people into our business, and that's the behaviours and values essence. What kind of person are we taking on? How are they going to deal with adversity? And it's a very important question, because we know in our industry, we're talking about extremes here, but we know even in normal times, in inverted commas, there's ups and downs every single day. And you need people that have got grit, determination, and resilience when you take them on board. And as I say, you will spot that very quickly when they're working for you.
Yeah, and just quickly, you can train for skills. So if they don't have the skills, you can train and make people more ready to change and to grow and to learn and to develop. It's more difficult with attitude, but before you think about giving up, or before you think about can I make this person better and all of that, you need to understand what their why is. Why are they here? Why are they behaving the way they're behaving? And once you understand that, is there capacity for them to change to be a bit more on board? No one will ever have your. I often speak to ladies who are like, they just don't get it. They're just not as motivated as I am. Well, you set up the business, you run the business. They won't be as motivated as that. But if they can be motivated to their why, then they can do good work for you. So don't just give up on them. But if they haven't got the skills and can't be developed, and they haven't got the attitude and don't want to, they probably shouldn't be working for you.
I think it's an interesting. We've talked about this a lot in the past about when the back's up against the wall, you want people who are going to stand back to back with you and drive out of this. And that goes back to your recruitment process, the people you bring in, and you recruit on behaviours and values, the will to do the job, and then skills. And yet in recruitment, which is why we've got a horrific turnover in year one, we recruit on skills, and the rest of it we're not really bothered about because we don't really think about it. It's times like this when you see the people, as Paul said, the ones that stand up that you didn't realise had that real will, drive, determined for the business to go forward. And so I think you've got to get the will right, and you've got to get the behavioural side right, because you could have the right will but the wrong behaviours, and you could have the right behaviours and the wrong will, and you'll never work. Skills you can train, as you said there, Dave. So I think it's about that, and I think it's developing it. So I think as we start to push out of this process and businesses starting to build again, when you start thinking about building your team, I would always anchor back. And that's one thing I always took from any recession I had. I always anchored back and thought, right, what type of person would I want if this happened again? And it meant that when I started to recruit my new teams, they were better people because they were more behavioral balanced and more will balanced than ever before, and we could train and develop the skill. And so it talked on the time about going forward, about think about the people you've recruited now, why you've recruited them, and what problems they've given or what positives they've given. Now think about the future, what's it going to help them need in the future. And I think that's what I took when you look at differing people, lack of skills, lack of will, lack of process. You know, you need to get it right. And therefore, if you've got it wrong in the past, you know, you've got to prove to yourself when you move forward that you're not going to repeat the same mistake and have it again put the business in jeopardy. Ladies and gents, thank you very much for your time. It's been a long wait coming for this webinar to come due to various different reasons. So thanks for attending. Next week, our podcast is out again. So if you've not come across the podcast, have a look on our YouTube channel or have a look on our website or any podcast channels. Recruitment Leaders Unlocked. We're now in series 2, which is all about leadership. It's the first one's out with people between 1 and 5 heads. Next week's is between 5 and 25 heads. It's some really interesting comments in that podcast. I've watched it already. So if you haven't seen it, go onto those sites, have a look at them. Feel free to subscribe, and we'll see you all again in a fortnight's time. Dave, Paul, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Howard. Thank you, everybody.
Cheers, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.